Hello and welcome to today's Augustana Human Library session. The title of today's human book is Tiny but Mighty, and this is the human book's abstract. My son was born 3 months early. On the day he was born, he weighed 1 pound, 2 ounces and was just under a foot long. His 4-month stay in the NICU was just the start of his and our journey. This human book will talk about what actually goes on inside a neonatal intensive care unit, what it's like to parent such a fragile child, and what life looks like now that he's an active, healthy, smart 4-year-old who happens to have autism spectrum disorder and dyspraxia.
Hi, thank you for coming. My name is Michelle, and my preemie is actually now 10 years old. So these experiences, I was talking to Nancy a little bit beforehand about how interesting it's been because there are a lot of actual similarities between living in the NICU and then living with a very fragile infant and being locked down for COVID. So it's brought back a lot of really interesting sort of things. I just wanted to check before I sort of get going with my story, whether any of you, and even if you can just answer in the chat, whether any of you have any experience with an infant in the NICU, have had a friend who's gone through this sort of experience, just so I have a sense of where I'm starting from and kind of how much I need to explain language and pieces like that. So I'll give you a minute just to type. Peggy Sue, did you see sort of pictures or any of those, or?
No, this was kind of in the pre-social media era. Her son is now 15, but when I read the description of you, he was born 3 months old before his due date. So I felt there were some similarities in that regard. So, but yeah, no, So I mean, like I do know, like some of the experience. I wasn't living here at the time either, so our communication was not very regular, and also what I would have heard at the time was after the fact. So in retrospect, anyway, I'm happy to hear anything about it. Thanks.
Yeah, we actually laugh because I think it was 2 weeks with Jack in the NICU when I bought my first iPhone, because you're sort of so isolated and have no way of really communicating anything. And they were still quite new at that point in 2010. So it just sort of dawned the smartphone era. So I will start with, so as you say, my son was born at what they call 27 and 6, so 27 weeks gestation and 6 days, just before 28 weeks when you're working on a 40-week calendar. So he weighed at the time 520 grams, which for those of you keeping track is 1 pound and 2 ounces. We had a lot of people trying to kind of describe him as a pound of butter. He was longer than that, so we talk about him as a pound of bacon because he wasn't compact. He was actually quite long, but I'm going to show you a picture in a minute. If you think about that 1 pound and 2 ounces, we're pretty convinced, or like the 520 grams, easily 450 of those grams was his head. So when you look at the rest of them, this is a picture of him on the day that he was born. I'm going to kind of get it to the camera as much as I can. If you look at that, there's a silver bracelet on his wrist. That's my husband's wedding ring. And the nurse who kind of received him in the NICU did that because he was born by C-section, and he and my husband kind of went one way and I went the other to post-recovery, and then couldn't see him for the first 2 days. So I actually didn't see him after he was born. I didn't see him until he was 2 days old. And so this was her way of trying to let me sort of see what he looked like and how big he was. So he was born that early. We discovered after the fact that the placenta never fully attached to my uterus. So he was having trouble getting blood flow and getting nutrition the entire time that I was pregnant. And as it turns out, I actually was very sick with a form of preeclampsia called HELP syndrome, but totally asymptomatic. So he and I together were not a good combination when he was inside, and they kind of very quickly discovered that he needed to be out rather than in. Something I'm going to point out about this picture, if you look at this, he's breathing right there through something called a CPAP mask. So if any of you know somebody who has trouble sleeping at night and has sleep apnea, and they get something called a CPAP mask, this is what it looks like on a little tiny person. He was not intubated until he was 3 days old. So he actually was able to breathe on his own with his little tiny lungs until he was 3 days old. And then he had a lung that collapsed, and he did have to be intubated and ventilated, and he was ventilated for a month after that. And then we had to kind of gradually work through that. So he was born at the beginning of June, spent 4 months in the NICU. We came home the week before Thanksgiving. So when you look at preemies, they typically talk about that they will spend the amount of time in NICU that they probably would have spent getting to term. So 3 months would have been an expectation that would have been to term, and then he would have gone home. In his case, he had a couple of other complicating factors that meant that we ended up spending an extra month there. And I should say that I live south of Red Deer. All of this happened in Edmonton. So we are huge proponents of the Stollery Children's Hospital, and lived for 4 months at the Royal Alex. So for those of you who kind of want to place it, the Stollery has a site, an extension at the Royal Alex, which is where all of their long-term NICU stays are. The site, the U of A site, only deals with pre and post-surgical babies. So super, super sick babies and those who are just going to surgery and coming out of surgery. Otherwise, they live longer term at the Alex site. And then once they don't need quite as much care, they can go down to secondary sites. So there's actually levels of NICU. The highest is a level 5, which is what the U of A site is. The Alex is a level 4, and that's where Jack and I lived for 4 entire months, and then we came home. He lived in something, again, for those of you who've seen it on TV. This is called an isolette. You will think of it as an incubator. So that's the little space, because when they are born, they can't regulate their temperature. They have no way of keeping themselves, being able to regulate their body temperature, stay warm, stay cool down. That isolette does that for them. The little hole that you can sort of see here, that's how we touched him. So you would be able to put your hands in through these 2 holes, and one of the things that we learned is that his skin was so thin when he was born. Your instinct when you have a baby is to rub them. We all kind of rub each other's backs. When you're comforting, that's your instinct to do it. Because his skin was so thin and his nerves hadn't fully developed yet, that was actually incredibly painful for him. So we had to train ourselves to be able to just put our hands stationary on him. So you could touch him just like this, but you couldn't rub him because that would actually hurt him. So we would put our hands through there, and you could just put your hand on him and touch him. The monitor next to him, that's keeping track of his breathing rate, so his oxygen saturation levels, his pulse. That was kind of, we lived and died by those numbers for a very, very long time, and they would let you know whether he was healthy, how he was doing, whether he was in distress or not, because obviously he couldn't tell us in any way. And because he was intubated and also had a feeding tube, he had no way of, like, he couldn't cry because he had too much stuff going down his throat. So you didn't ever hear his voice. So those numbers really were how we could tell how he was doing and whether he was in any kind of pain or distress. Super weird to be talking to boxes, which I'm in meetings all the time, and you'd think I'd be used to this by now, but I'm not. To give you a sense of the scale of what we're talking about, this is the size of a diaper that he would have worn when he was born. So this little tiny thing, and it was huge on him. You would sort of put it around him like this until he grew a lot bigger. This is one of his little blood pressure cuffs. So this would have gone around his, we would move it, so it would be around his wrist or around one of his feet. We'd move it every day because otherwise it would form sores. But again, you can sort of see how big it is on me. When you look at him in the picture, you can see it wrapped around his little foot there. So think about sort of the scale of that. And my husband and I used to joke that you get so used to, because we lived there for 4 months, and I would literally, I slept at the Alex. They have long-term dorms for the moms who live there. So I'd walk through in the morning, kind of sleep there at night, and spend the entire time on this unit. And so you got used to that this was the scale of babies. And then I would kind of, if I ended up at the mall on the weekend just to grab some food or something like that, and I would see parents out with like 3-month-old babies or 6-month-old babies, and they looked like these giant monsters to me because of this. It was so out of proportion with what I was used to looking at. So we used to kind of keep thinking, what are these other people doing to these babies? Because you get so used to seeing them tiny all the time. I'm trying to think. So we spent 4 months there. I said he was intubated. One of the biggest things that you spend your time doing in the NICU is something called kangaroo care. There's an enormous amount of research that shows that the more that babies can be skin to skin with you, and this is true of all babies, but particularly true of preemies, they get out of the NICU faster, they learn how to regulate their own temperature faster, they, if they're sick, are healthier longer. So we spent hours looking just like this. You'd have a special gown, and in this case, he's intubated. So it would take 3 people to get him out of that isolette and attach him, and his breathing tube is actually taped to my shoulder. So 3 people to get him out there, to get him settled. You had to be there for at least an hour, preferably 2, before they would put him back in, because it was such a sort of a process to get him in and out. So you had to make really sure you'd gone to the bathroom ahead of time and thought through things very carefully, and got very good at modulating liquid intake and all those sorts of things. But we would spend hours just sitting in these chairs holding him. And what was remarkable was you could see, I said we looked at those monitors, you could see his pulse go down. You could see his blood pressure normalize. You could see if he was any kind of distress. As soon as you got him settled there and he sorted, all of his stats would regulate, and he would start to sort of breathe with me. It would keep him warmer. And I say me, my husband did that as well. So we spent as much time as possible with both of us, skin to him. What's interesting to me is, to this day, if he's upset, he nestles his head right in here. So it's still very much a comfort to him 10 years later to settle in and sort out. So in terms of that journey, he was intubated for a month, which means he had a breathing tube. At the same time, he also had a feeding tube, because babies who are born that early, their stomachs are not yet ready to handle even milk. So they're fed intravenously, nutritional soup, kind of. And then we actually had to go through a process where we had to wean him off sort of this steady diet of food. We had to teach his stomach how to shrink and how to grow, and to teach him how to be hungry, basically, which sort of seems like this very odd thought, but that's all stuff that would happen quite normally if they were still inside. And when they're outside, you have to do all of these things artificially for them. So once we switched him off this nutritional soup and he had a feeding tube, he was fed constantly for a while, and then eventually they started to slow down and they would only feed him a little bit and then they would turn it off and start to teach his stomach how to just have this amount of food and then to digest that and be hungry for a little while. And then eventually we weaned him off the feeding tube, and we had to try and start to teach him how to nurse. He was never very good at that. I did pump breast milk the entire time I was in there. I didn't make a lot. As it turns out, you mostly make the hormones to make breast milk in the last trimester of your pregnancy. So if you skip the last trimester of your pregnancy, you also skip the point when all those hormones would develop. But we did sort of try as much as we could, and then they would mix them with formula at the hospital. So for us, even teaching him how to eat was a process of, he would nurse, we would weigh him, he would nurse, we would weigh him again to try and get some sense of how much he'd actually had. Then we would supplement with this super high protein formula to try and make sure that he had whatever the dietitian had decided was the appropriate amount of food for him at that point. And then you would do the whole thing over again 3 hours later. So it was a very structured way of trying to do that, because he was so tiny and because the entire focus of everybody in that place was to get him to grow, to be big enough and strong enough to be able to come home with us and to be healthy with us. So I'm trying to think of sort of details in the story. So we spent all of that time at the Alex. He, during that time, had laser surgery to both eyes. So those of you who maybe have heard a little bit about preemies will know that a lot of them, especially a number of years ago, there was a really strong problem with preemies going blind. What they've figured out is that there is a correlation between the amount of oxygen support that they receive, because most of them don't have fully developed lungs and can't breathe on their own. And so it's not a direct causal relationship. They haven't figured out kind of exactly what it is, but there's a strong correlation between that and their retinas kick into an overdevelopment stage. And a lot of them actually end up with detached retinas. So he would get checked by the eye doctors once a week through this process that I was fascinated by. Like, NICU nurses are hardcore. These are people who have seen things. Most of the procedures were bedside. They don't move them to operating rooms. They don't move them to a lot of spaces. He got chest tubes and all of those things. Those were in his bed, and his bedside nurse was assisting with all of that. So they've seen a lot of stuff. They hated the eye exams because they would kind of clamp their little eyes open with what I can only describe as this like Clockwork Orange looking clamp. And every single NICU nurse would just look away. They hated it. But they would check it every month. And then when they started to see signs of that retinal overdevelopment, they can go in now and do laser surgery that corrects it. So he had that in both eyes. He has to still go and get his eyes dilated every year where they kind of check on that retinal development. But other than that, he's good. And he also developed hernias just before we went home, which is super common. Boys develop hernias all the time, and little hernias in their groins. But when you're in the hospital, because there's a chance of those perforating, they don't let you go home. So a number of surgeries, 3, maybe 4 surgeries, all before he was 4 months old. And then when we got him home, his body did not make, his bone marrow took a little while to catch up with the rest of him. And he didn't at the time make the blood cells that you need to be able to fight bacterial infections. So he had red blood cells, he had white blood cells, and he could fight viral infections, but not bacterial infections, which meant that we couldn't leave the house because he could have gone from spiking a fever to dead in 4 hours. So that's where I say this COVID lockdown has been oddly familiar for us, because even once we got him home from the NICU, I couldn't take him to the grocery store. We couldn't do mommy and me classes. We didn't, even friends who came over had to kind of go through this interview process of, are you at all sick? Is anybody in your household sick? What's going on? We are expert hand washers, have been ever since then. So again, I'm really good at that in bathrooms right now. It is amazing how many people will just randomly touch babies in public that I had never really thought about before, but strangers will just randomly come up and touch your baby all the time. And if you have a fragile baby where that could kill them, you become really sort of good at protecting and hiding them from that. What happens with a preemie after that is that their development is measured differently. So you always deal with their actual age, their birth age, and then a corrected age. Because when you're looking at developmental milestones, like when they're supposed to sit up, when they're supposed to roll over, all of those pieces, those are typically measured in months. Well, it's not fair when you're looking at somebody who's born 3 months early. If you're supposed to roll over at 6 months, well, he was kind of technically only 3 months. So we would talk about that he was 6 months, but he was 3 months corrected. And everything was working with that corrected date, which was always kind of correlated with his due date. So that when we were working with anybody looking at any of those developmental milestones, and they continue that up until they're the age of 5. I know a lot of experts who talk about that they should actually continue that all the way until adulthood, because preemies just work differently. When your brain is subjected to what is not a typical course of development, they just follow their own paths. So we would kind of spend a lot of time looking at him again, especially in those first couple of years, where you just get used to that that's the language. He's 6 months, but he's 3 months corrected, because he's not the size that everybody expects a 6-month-old to be. And he's not doing what a 6-month-old should be doing. One of the funny blessings of being in a NICU, though, is that you come out with this phenomenal support system that would take months to years to access afterwards. So in Red Deer right now, there is, I believe, an 18-month waiting list to see a pediatrician. We weren't allowed to leave the NICU until we had a pediatrician appointment the following week. So somebody from the NICU was calling the pediatrician's office saying, this baby's coming, who's got room on their caseload, this is what's happening. There's a clinic that happens at the Glen Rose where they check the development of these babies every 6 months and then every year. So when he started not following a typical path of development, even for a preemie, we caught that really early. We had people who were looking at it saying, he should be turning, you're not seeing it yet. He's not eating the way we think most kids typically pick up eating. So let's try and get you some occupational therapy. Let's try and get you some physical therapy. We had been warned because he had an episode that moment when he was 3 days old. His heart stopped for 8 minutes, which is a very long time for your heart to stop. And so we had been warned very early on to start to watch for speech delays, is where that very often will show up. And so when he wasn't speaking when he was supposed to, we knew to look for speech therapy really, really early and quickly for him. Where we are at now with him, he's a very active, happy 10-year-old boy who's out jumping in our backyard right now. But he does have some challenges that I think can only be connected back to this. So he is on the autism spectrum. He's very bright. He's very verbal. He has a lot of sensory issues, a lot of issues with sound particularly, and a lot of pieces really around his mouth. And we don't know how much of that is just the autism and how much of it is connected to how much intervention there was connected to his mouth when he was first born, when you've got people stuffing all of those tubes down there and doing all of this work around your mouth. you're bound to have issues with sort of how everything feels around there later on. It just is, there's no way that you can come out of that without that. He also has something called dyspraxia, which is a motor planning disorder. And we now know that that's what led to him turning later, walking later, crawling later, speaking later. He still struggles with eating. So dyspraxia means that he has trouble creating a motor plan. So he can know what he wants to do, but his brain doesn't easily create a motor plan for it. And the easiest way to think about it is that we had a doctor explain it as when you learn somebody's name for the first time. So when all of us read Harry Potter and we didn't know how to say Hermione until we heard somebody say Hermione, and then we would say it 2 or 3 times. And then your mouth has the motor plan for how to say Hermione. He has to repeat that same word about 150 to 200 times for his mouth to have that same motor plan. So he at 10 still has to think about, how do I get my body into a car? How do I get my body out of a car? How do I fasten the seatbelt? All of those other things that if you look at a more typical 10-year-old, their bodies just know how to do that. He has to think through every day. How am I going to move in this space? How do I hold my body this way? Learning to write is harder for him. Learning to type is harder for him. Looking at food, there's still foods that he can't eat because 80% of the muscles in your body are in your face. And a vast majority of them are in your mouth to control speech, to control eating. And so when you're trying to move all those muscles in this really intricate, subtle way, that's really, really, really complicated, which is a thing I never knew until we sort of started to live in this world.
I have the benefit of knowing you for a long time and hearing lots of, well, the ways that you approach doing lots of things differently than most parents would experience. I remember a few summers ago you talked about, or falls ago, you talked about the summer process of teaching him how to put peanut butter or whatever on his toast. Why don't you talk a little bit about those kind of things? Because I'm assuming that kind of, as you were just saying, motor, it's not just a motor skill, you know the right words, but I'm assuming that kind of, I'm not sure what to say.
We're still working on peanut butter on toast.
Yeah. And so, but with the way you think it through is, does he remember how to pick up the knife today? Does he remember, is this peanut butter, how hard the peanut butter is going to be, how hard you put it on the toast? Like it's breaking things down into many steps that, you know, like you said, people wouldn't normally have to process. But from a parenting perspective, that's very different than, you know, most people would say, put the peanut butter on your toast and carry on. And so that has to be, well, how do you manage your family dynamic, I guess, in that too? You must be the master of patience.
Well, you know what though, it is, but at the same time, what helps with that is knowing that it's never, he's always trying. It's not for lack of trying, and it's having to sort of, once you click into that, it's not that he's just being lazy about it, although he is very much a kid who will happily have somebody else do something for him if they are willing to do that. He's never been an I will do it myself kid ever. So there's some forcing that has to happen there. But once you start to actually break down how complex a task like putting peanut butter on toast is, and you look at every individual movement that has to be figured out. So you have to be able to pick up the peanut butter jar. You have to be able to take the lid off. Well, we buy peanut butter in bulk because it's one of his main foods. And so that giant Costco jar of peanut butter, if your hands are little, you can't hold it in one hand and then twist it on the other. Then you have to figure out how to pick up the knife, scoop out the peanut butter, put it on the toast, hold the knife properly. Being able to spread is a very different motion from being able to cut, and he doesn't do crusts, so we had to spend some time learning how to cut crusts off things. And then how to actually, like, it's once you start to really break that down, and we've been really, really fortunate. We've had a couple of really amazing, amazing occupational therapists in our lives who've been phenomenal at helping us see how hard some things are, and teach us strategies for working with him. So one of the biggest ones is backward chaining, where you do everything except the last step, so that then he experiences success because he finishes whatever the task is. So if it's something like the peanut butter piece, I start getting the jar and I get the peanut butter on the peanut butter, and then he's just spreading. And then we go back one more step, and then we go back one more step. It's actually how we teach him how to say new words as well. We start with the last syllable and then we move backwards. But it means that the focus is really on success. You do still have to have a lot of patience, and I'm better at it in some days than others. I'm the first to admit. There's something else I was going to say about that, and I can't remember what it is now. But I think the other thing that's really important for us, and we spend a lot of time with the school especially, because if you aren't looking for it and you don't understand, doing that kind of work, if you think about when you're learning a new motor plan, so if you're learning how to snowboard for the first time, you are tired at the end of that day because you've had to really think about how to move your body. You've fallen down a lot. His every day is like that. He has to think about how to sit in a desk. If he's in a gym class, he has to think about how to run more than another kid does. He has to rethink about how to throw a ball constantly. And then he's also, when you have sensory issues on top of that, processing noise differently. We always find that spring is really hard for him. And it took us a while until I actually read the blog of somebody who was autistic, who talked about, from a sensory perspective, spring is a hot mess. You're used to winter, especially in somewhere like Canada, where you've lived in this very closed-in environment. And then we start opening windows. There's all these noises you haven't heard about. The temperature's all over the place. You don't know what to wear. And you're wearing about 6 outfits in a day most times. There's all this pollen going on. You're getting breezes on your skin that you've never had before. So if you're trying to process all of that, math has no hope of getting in on top of all of that. So like the school will sort of often say to us, he did okay in the morning, not so much in the afternoon. And I'm like, yep, he's tired. He's done by the afternoon. You don't realize how much he's run a marathon every single day just by being there. And so there's pieces around that I think the more, I just really think the more that we can talk about that, the more that you start to look at him, if you start to see how carefully he crawls into and out of a car in comparison to most other kids, and start to think about how would that feel for you if you were doing that all day long. There's just more empathy that comes out of what a typical day looks like for him and how hard he's working all the time. So patience comes from that, but again, no saint. There are good days and bad days around what that looks like, but I cannot say enough for, we've had therapists we've been less in love with as well, but we've been really, really fortunate with some of the good ones. The other thing I was going to say was this occupational therapist has also been really, really helpful at having us look at the end goal. So he was having trouble for a really long time. We had in this house very old-fashioned sort of hot water taps in his bathroom that were these twist hot water taps, and they were really hard to turn on and off. And we were struggling with, and how are we teaching him, and he's not washing his hands after he goes to the bathroom, and it's this huge problem. And the OT finally looked at us one day and said, well, is the goal to have him turn on the tap, or is the goal to have him wash his hands? Because change the taps. And we went, right. So there's a lot around where you can modify the environment and start to think about, what is my end goal here? And are there things that we can modify to make that end goal possible for him? Because the taps don't matter. That's not the being able to screw this super hard tap. I care that your hands are clean. So I can swap a tap out, that's $50 at the hardware store and we're done. So it's sometimes really having somebody think through that perspective for you. And that always comes to, when I'm doing anything with him, what is my end goal? Is my end goal that you're doing whatever this skill is, or is my end goal that you get this other place and this thing in the middle doesn't matter, so we're going to eliminate that?
Michelle, Charlene had a comment in the chat box. First of all, she says, "Thank you, Michelle. You are an amazing, brave woman, i.e. a typical wonderful mother." I was really interested in your story because I do research on adverse birth outcomes, autism, childhood cancer, and other pediatric environmental health issues. Your story really inspires me to keep on it.
Which I very much appreciate. I think this story is more common than people think it is. What's funny is how much, when you have a preemie, how much you start to hear about other people who are preemies or have preemies, or it's not the standard narrative we hear about this, but it is more and more common. Now, I live in a world where, like most of us, because if you start to live in a world where you're parenting a kid with disabilities and you then mostly talk about to other parents who have kids with disabilities, and very often they have birth stories that look like ours, and there are very definitely connections around all of that, but it's something that I think the more we talk about, the more we start to realize it's a lot more common than we think.
Michelle, I have a question about the words thing. So when you're having to review a word for him, so if you're teaching him how to say library, like I would say, as I'm reading a book with a child, if they're trying to spell or speak words phonetically kind of thing, lib, rare, e, this is an L, this is an I. So you're starting at re? Is that what you mean?
I'm starting at E. So you're going to say E, and then you're going to say re, and then you're going to say brary, and then you're going to say library. And for whatever reason, for kids who are dyspraxic, that's a better way to make the motor plan.
Interesting.
And we found that, so we were in speech therapy with him for a little over a year before they finally figured out that was what was going on. So originally they were treating him for a speech delay, which is kind of the standard assumption when kids aren't speaking. What was interesting about him was that so Jack has read since the age of 2 words, and he could sign fluently. So he could sign 3 and 4 word sentences because we had worked with sign language on him. He couldn't say mama. And that's when there was a speech therapist who finally clued into that it was about the motor planning in his mouth and not about the comprehension of language at all. With him, I am completely convinced that he taught himself to read in order to teach himself to speak. Because if we show him the word, then he 9 times out of 10 can say it, because he can see those letters and he understands how those go together. And I believe fully he figures out how to adapt. He's fascinating. If you kind of get out of his way and let him do it his way, he will get there. So I see Kitty having a question in the thing about what do I see for his future. I don't know. I think like any parent, that is up to him. I think he is fully capable of going to university, holding a job. I think there are parts of his life that will always be harder for him. Kids on the spectrum have a lot of difficulty with something called executive functioning. So that's all the stuff that helps you figure out how to get somewhere on time, helps you figure out how to organize your day. They call that executive functioning. That's a real struggle for him. So I can see him always needing to have somebody in his life who can make sure that he's actually getting out of the house on time, that he has food in the fridge and has thought through that he needs to stop at the grocery store to be able to make sure food happens, and some of those things. What I am encouraged by is that we are hearing more and more adults who are on the spectrum who are being very open about their experience and about how they see the world and what they need from the world in order to live in it. We are seeing more and more people who are starting to understand that for him, for instance, an open concept workplace is not going to work. This is a kid who's going to need an office with a door. And so if you can get the right workplace who understands that and who can see what he brings to the table, he sees the world very differently. And that is an enormous strength if you can pay attention to that. He sees patterns where most of us don't. From a problem-solving standpoint, that's enormously useful. So it's as I think we hear more people like Temple Grandin and I mean, she's one of the most outspoken who's really able to articulate what the world looks like for her, but you're also seeing Hannah Gadsby came out as autistic quite recently and has talked about what that world looks like for her. It's not the primary piece of her identity, it is a piece, but only a piece. And as you're starting to see more and more of that happen, I think the world's starting to understand that it just needs to look a little bit different. We've worked really, really hard in his class. A lot of the narrative has often been he needs to change to make everybody else in the class comfortable. And we push back on that a lot. He needs to meet the class in the middle and he needs to understand what the social rules are, but the class also needs to understand what he needs. And so we were really fortunate in grade 1 to have a teacher who used to say, there were a couple of girls who really, really liked him. And they would see him from across the playground and they would yell, "Jack," at the top of their voices, and they'd come running towards him. And he read that as threat and was terrified of it and would just shrink into this little ball. And it wasn't what these girls intended. But we had a teacher who not only said, okay, Jack, you need to see that they're really liking you and they're trying to make friends, but could also say to those girls, if you want to be his friend, you need to understand that that's not how you approach him. So it's working on both sides to say, how come he has to be uncomfortable so that everybody else is comfortable? That's not fair, and that doesn't work for me as a parent. If there's a thing that he's doing that is distracting or impeding, that's one thing. But if you're out in public and somebody happens to be flapping their hands, he's not a flapper, but some kids do that for a sensory reason, is that hurting you in any way, shape, or form? Because if it's not, then who cares? If that makes it possible for that person to be in that space, have at her, flap. Why does it matter? I don't know if that answers your question, Kitty, but that's what I hope for him, I guess I would say.
Oh, I have one more question.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you as a parent deal with like the dichotomies that he presents? Because on the one hand, he needs a lot of nurturing and a lot of kind of process kind of stuff. But then his intellect, like I recall when he was, I don't know, kindergarten, he was reading at the grade 6 level or something like that. So now that he's a few years older, is he, grade 9, grade 10? And how does he manage in a classroom where kids may or may not understand him? And intellectually, he's, maybe bored, but probably just farther ahead.
Yeah. There's a couple things. There's one piece is that this is our normal. We don't have another child. So I don't have a comparison point for him other than nieces and nephews and sort of and friends. But for us, this is how I parent him because this is how we've always parented him because this is just how it works. So that again is kind of a blessing and a curse. We don't fight it in the way that I have had friends who've had typical children and then non-typical children. They tend to fight that a little bit more because they've seen typical, whereas we didn't have that. So this is our normal, this is what it looks like, and this is how we roll. As far as that dichotomy of so the reading piece, we actually monitor what he reads very carefully for emotional content, because I know that he can read far, cognitively understand far beyond what he emotionally is able to handle. So, and it's been interesting since we've been locked down, because he's kind of gotten desperate and been grabbing all sorts of books off the shelves. And I have to kind of look at it and go, that one's a grown-up book. And it feels funny to say that, but it's more about that it's hyper-violent content. It's got, because we as adults read all sorts of things that kids just aren't emotionally ready for yet. So we watch a lot of that. The school piece is a constant battle. It's a battle around, does he understand it, but he just can't show it to you, because that's often the case. Does he genuinely not understand it because he was busy with something else in his head and he missed that entire lesson? Is he bored and has skipped 6 steps beyond you? It's been interesting having him at home, kind of getting a sense of where he just leaps ahead. And so trying to teach him something like fractions, where he was going 6 steps past because his brain just did that. But then you've got to show him the steps, because you know that breaking it down later on, that's going to be important. So it's pieces of that. And you have to have teachers and you have to have EAs who understand that and are really creative around that. And not every teacher and not every EA has the training or the experience to be able to do that. And you have to have known enough kids like this to know that every kid like this is unique. And there's this tendency that we have as a society to say, oh, he's autistic, so this is what he needs. Or, oh, he's got anxiety issues, so this is what he needs, rather than looking at him. And one of the perfect examples I can give is that very often for people on the spectrum, one of the organizing tools that they recommend, that OTs and therapists recommend, are something called visual schedules, where you have pictures that sort of display what is supposed to happen. He, from very early on, would get distracted because he wouldn't understand what the picture would mean, but because he could read so early, we would just put the word, and that would make way more sense. So we have to work every time to say, okay, you might be used to visual schedules. That doesn't work for him because he can come up with 6 different words for whatever that picture is. So you need the word if you want that to be really clear. So it's a lot of advocating constantly, listening constantly, fighting through a lot of those pieces to try and make sure that people can see what he has and can bring to the table, because he's not old enough yet to be able to do that work for himself. And then part of it as he gets older will be us trying to teach him how to do that. Thank you about the kangaroo care. I cannot speak highly enough about it. We were fortunate that we were in a NICU who believed very, very deeply in the power of that and would move heaven and earth to do it. And like I say, it's fascinating to me to watch how much, when he's in distress, he goes immediately back to that still 10 years later. That's his comfort place. And I think that's from all of those hours. Yes, the public health care piece. I always feel like I have a really excellent answer. When we were in the States last year, and there was somebody who, they were having the debate around Obamacare at the time, and somebody who sort of very honestly and openly said, "You're from Canada, how does that work and what does that mean to you?" And I said, well, it means that I have a son, because I asked once and NICU care for him would have been about $100,000 a day. And to have to try and make care decisions based on whether I could afford to keep him alive or not, I am very profoundly lucky that we never had to make that call. So yeah, the public health care, the early interventions piece, that's stuff that's getting defunded as we speak. So I can't advocate for it enough. I can't ask you to advocate for it enough. It makes all the difference in the world to have access to those therapies early for parents to have access to the kinds of supports and people who can teach you how to parent your child in the way that your child needs. Because that doesn't just come out of somewhere. I don't have degrees in occupational therapy and physical therapy and psychology and neurology, and I was not forward thinking enough to do all of that graduate work before having a child. So we need those people in our lives. We joke that from day one, parenting has been a team sport in our house. And we don't understand actually how parents who just do that without all of these other people in their worlds, how they do things. Because we lost my husband's father a couple of years ago, and he really struggled. We had a psychologist to call who knew Jack and who knew us, where we could say, okay, this is how he's reacting to this death of this person. We're so fortunate that we just have this team in our life now, that if we aren't sure how to do something, we have people we can call who can help us figure that out. Not everybody has access to that. We're rural. We are particularly conscious of how fortunate we are to have good people, because rural access to that is very difficult. I talk about that he was in Edmonton. We, for the first year of his life, drove back and forth to Edmonton at least once a month. We just this fall ended our last yearly appointment in Edmonton, to where now all of our medical care is actually in Red Deer. That's 10 years later. We're really, really lucky that we were able to do some of that. But again, not every parent can do that. It was an hour-long eye appointment is a day off work for me, a day off school for him. That's an impact that I think people don't think about.
Thank you very much, Michelle. I honestly think I don't know anybody, and I mean, it's because of the situation you were put into at some degree, but I don't think I know anybody that has such intentionality in the parenting. It's, I find it really interesting, and I'm just very thankful for Jack.
Yeah, we're all very thankful for him. I thank you for this opportunity to tell my story and his story. I think it's the more that we can sort of talk about what this looks like, the more that hopefully it becomes a little bit more normal, and people can see that this is a story just like any other story.
Yeah,
it just
right.
happens to be ours.
Yeah.
So thank you for coming and listening.
Excellent. Thanks, everyone.